what I want to talk about is I'm not a huge believer in just giving people huge amounts of debating theory, as I don't really think that's that accessible necessarily, and often isn't that transferable for debate to debate. So, just what I want to do for maybe the first 10 minutes is give you a few thoughts I have on what you need to do analytically in a debate, what stages you need to pass when it comes to making an argument. And then I think the most useful thing to do is do a few brainstorming sessions of various motions and types of motions which come up, and look at the ways in which we can make some of those simple arguments better. In part because I think one of the most useful things to do is to realize that there are only about 6 debates which come up again and again. Often there's going to be slightly different specific material in each one of those debates. But if you have a strong grasp of the basic arguments, how to make them and how to frame them, you save yourself 10 or 15 minutes in prep time, which is incredibly useful. And then you can spend the rest of your preparation time just looking at the more interesting arguments throughout the debate. So the first thing I just want to ask is, what do you think the most important point of analysis is? What do you think analysis should be in a debate?
Complete.
Okay, but well, I'm asking a more basic question, which is, why do you bother with analysis at all, other than judges tell you need it?
To prove the burden.
Be persuasive.
Okay.
Winning the most important issue.
Okay, so it's about being persuasive. It's about dealing with the most important issue. What else is the purpose of it?
To make something comprehensible.
Right.
What's the burden? Burden of proof?
Yeah.
Be coherent.
Yeah.
Prove why I'm right instead of just saying it.
Absolutely. So one thing which I think lots of people get wrong or never quite realize is analysis isn't there just for its own sake. You explain arguments because explaining arguments makes them comprehensible, explaining arguments makes them persuasive. The reason I want to stress that is there will be cases where you'll be stating something which is really obvious, which all teams in the debate will accept. And there's often a temptation to spend 30 seconds or 1 minute explaining that. But that really isn't strategically very useful in the debate. And I think if you start by always asking not only why is this true, but also, do I need to prove this is true, you often better allocate your time. These are just some of the background ideas which I want to just get across. The second, and this sounds a little bit unfair to some judges, but is normally true. There are 2 rules I generally have when trying to make an argument. The first is always assume your judge is an idiot. The reason is partly many judges aren't that good. Many judges also just don't listen. And it is always important that you explain not only your arguments well, but often why you are making those arguments. And I think that's something which teams and speakers often don't do. They just assume that it's obvious where your argument fits into a debate. So it's almost always important to try and explain what the purpose of the argument is and where it fits in the context of the debate. We'll talk more about that looking at specific examples. The third thing I always try and tell people, and I think it's often where you end up with disagreements with judges, is that the important thing in debating isn't what you say, it isn't what you think you say, but is what the judges hear you having said. Yet again, this should be quite obvious. And in general, none of these rules should change what you do, but it's always good to have this in the back of your mind, that what you're trying to do with analysis is persuade people, explaining the contentious issues, not all the issues, not just explaining why for the sake of it, but doing so to look at the contentious issues. It is trying to add analysis to explain why your argument is important and what it is doing in the context of a debate. And is trying to explain it in a way that appeals to judges which aren't necessarily going to be listening to every word you're saying, who aren't necessarily going to be the best judges and may often just be wrong in what they do. And that, I think, is the background of why we do analysis at all and what it needs to aim, what the aim is when you make an argument. So, having just said that as background, what do you need? What do you mean by analysis? Or when we say you haven't analyzed an argument well, or you need to have more analysis to it, that's an interesting buzzword, but I think it's fairly incomprehensible to the majority of people because it obviously can mean a huge number of things. So if someone asked you to analyze an argument, what would you think they meant?
Well, I would say many judges just say, well, they didn't buy it when they say you needed more analysis. Like, it made sense, but it didn't really make sense. Or like, it was not persuasive in the way that I would believe it.
Yeah, I mean, when a judge says they didn't buy it, more often than not, it's that they didn't really even understand the argument or really couldn't come up with anything better to say about it. I mean, I didn't buy it is often true, but it's not at all explanatory as to why the argument wasn't persuasive.
But,
so,
no, but I mean, that's what many judges mean when they say there was no analysis.
Yeah.
They, in the end, well, just didn't know what to make out of the argument and used analysis as a proxy to say, well...
Or they're bad judges and just don't know anything else to say.
Well, exactly. And this is why I always find the term "you need more analysis" or "this is what analysis is" to be really quite confusing in a debate, because more often than not, it doesn't have any meaning. The judge who uses it really just didn't know what was going on in the debate. But let's use a more ideal type. What would it mean to you if someone realistically said you didn't have analysis, or if you were to say to yourself, I need more analysis, what would you mean?
It was too complicated.
Okay.
I wouldn't.
Well,
because it could be very complicated. You could have very good analysis.
Yeah, but for me it is like saying,
like perhaps not simplifying it enough to the basic getting to the basic comprehensible premises that everyone could agree upon, and not explaining the significance of those premises in relation to the motion.
Okay.
It also depends on the kind of claim you're making. If it's a claim that to the judge will sound very outlandish or very unlikely, then you put an additional penalty on the argument, saying, okay, I'm willing to buy that, but you have to explain to me exactly why this is true and why this is relevant. So it kind of also depends on the judge's personal bias and what he more readily will accept as a valid argument. Right.
So the first thing I think to take from that is all explanation ends somewhere. We often say at the start of debates, and when you learn how to debate, that it's important that you keep asking yourself why. Logically speaking, there's going to be a point where you just can't explain things anymore. That's certainly true in the format of debating, where you have 7 minutes to explain 3 or 4 arguments. There's going to be a point where you just need the judge to believe it. So it's never quite enough just to think of analysis as trying to explain why, because that's always going to be impossible at some point. There will be at some point you'll just need to state this is true and work from there. That I think is an important lesson to take out of it. More generally, though, I think there are 4 things you'll need to do with each and every argument, which people call and lump together as analysis, but mean different things. The first was stated, which was, arguments can be complicated, that's fine, but it's important to state them in a clear way, such that everyone can follow them. And again, when we're saying that lots of judges, when they say, I don't buy it, or you didn't have analysis, it's often because they don't understand the argument. And don't give them that excuse. It is worth spending that 10-15 seconds to work out what is the simplest way I can headline this argument, and what are the simple ways I can explain the argument. The most important skill in debating often isn't your ability to explain the argument, but is instead the ability to clearly elucidate what you mean. It is that clarity of expression which is often the most important thing. some people might call that analysis, others won't, but I think it's a useful starting point. The second is every time you make an argument, there are questions you need to ask yourself. The first is, by and large, I'm going to assume there's a policy debate, but this is applicable in other circumstances as well, which is, as a result of this policy, you end up with an outcome X. Why is that true? That's the first question you need to ask. Why exactly does this result from the policy? And obviously, you can't explain why to infinitesimally small detail, but you can explain it to a degree which a reasonable person would find to be persuasive, because it would start with premises which they would find to be logical. So that's the second step, I think, in almost any well-analyzed argument. The third step is this outcome X is good or this outcome X is bad. Often, though not always, it will be obvious that if your policy saves huge amounts of money, or if your policy saves a large number of lives, that will be a good thing. But that isn't always going to be the case. So to give you an example from Worlds many years ago, there was a motion about military conscription. And the proposition decided to make arguments about how ending military conscription would make the US Army far more effective. To which the opposition argued that this policy does make the US Army much more effective, but that isn't a good thing because that might make the US far more war hungry. That in many ways was an odd argument to make, but it hit the very premise of the argument which the proposition in that debate was making, because they never considered that they might need to justify why these policies, why this outcome which they were striving for was a good outcome. So it's something which you'll always want to have at the back of your mind. Have I shown that this is desirable, and will a reasonable person agree with me? The third point, the final thing which you would always want to say when it comes to almost any argument you make, is probably the most important, kind of, in that, if you assume it's true anyway, which is, why is this argument important in a debate? Now, almost every single debate is obviously has arguments on both the proposition and the opposition. If it didn't, we probably wouldn't set it as a debate. What that means is, in a reasonably balanced debate, when you're not much better than the other teams, you're going to win some arguments and you're going to lose some arguments. The final point about analysis is what I think some people call comparative analysis, which is, why are the arguments I win more important than the arguments I lose? Or when you make any single argument, why does it matter that I've won that particular argument? Where does it fit in to the debate overall? Why is this an important argument for me to win in a debate? And again, I think what often happens when you lose debates, it isn't because you haven't explained your argument quite well. It's just that the other side has conceded your argument and said, but here are other things which are more important or equally important. And because teams often just never really think about explaining why they are saying what they are saying, they lose out comparatively. So every single time you make any argument, you need to ask yourself those questions. How do I explain it clearly? Why does this occur? Why is this good or bad? And why is this argument important? And you need to answer those as well as you can. That, I think, is, in a very simple case, all we mean when we ever say analysis, which is, do you have those explanations implicitly or explicitly when you make your case? Is any questions about that? Just because I think that's probably a good place to start in terms of why we ever discuss analysis in debates.
Not about that, but when you first started, you said there were 6 debates that are often Can you just list them out? So, because I have mine, but I'm curious to know yours. Can you hear me?
Oh, well, so I don't necessarily have just 6 debates. I don't quite know how to label them. But the kinds of debates you will be talking about in brief are debates about free choice, when it's desirable, when it's not, which are the same as debates about governmental intervention. Debates about reallocation towards minority groups or away from majority or privileged groups, which can be applied in multiple different ways. Debates about the desirability and limitations of free speech. Debates more generally just about equity, not necessarily with minority groups, but more in terms of redistribution within society and fulfilling those various functions. Oh, just debates about social equity or social equality, and in other words, just the role of the state in terms of redistribution, which is similar but conceptually separate than looking at disadvantaged minority groups. And then what I would guess would be 2 different sets of international relations debates, which are both debates about dominant powers using various tools to defeat weaker powers or to make other states do what you want them to do. And finally, just debates about best parts to economic development. Which isn't as, it's actually the 7th, which is debates about the desirability and limitations of democracy. That was 7, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's why my quality one shouldn't be in 2. But those, I think, are the most basic sets of debates which you have. Obviously, there are multiple different subsections within that, lots of different applications of each of those debates, which has particular matter, particular facts, and particular arguments. But I think one of the important issues is if you know the arguments you want to make in each of those sets of debates, you're often in a very good position overall when it comes to dealing with any debate you get. On occasion, someone might throw something a little bit quirky at you, but that's a little bit unlikely, I think. Does anyone have any? I imagine so. No one has any questions about the basis of analysis before I just move on and we start talking about some specific debates, some specific themes in debates, and how we can analyze those arguments fully.
Don't think so. No, makes sense.
Wait, Andreas.
You said you started, but okay, you talked about the outcome a lot, but what about the problem, identifying the right problem? Because I've always been told that, okay, emotion is the answer to a question, what is the question? So how does that tie into your analysis?
So I've never once thought of a emotion as necessarily a solution to a question. There could be, or another way of putting it is, I don't necessarily think there is a problem you need to solve. One of the problems I think with seeing debates is, here is a problem, here is a solution to that problem, does it solve that problem, is you're often limited in what you think you are doing in the debate. So I'll give you some, first theoretically, it's possible that you could set a debate about helping a group which is already in a reasonably good position. So there isn't necessarily a huge problem to solve. You can just make the world slightly better, which I guess you could phrase as a problem, but I don't think it's necessarily hopeful for you to do so. So I think if you think of debates just as a problem, you might be limiting the arguments you make, both because there could be multiple problems, both because a debate could just be about making something good better, which is still a reason to pass a policy. But I know lots of people like thinking in terms of debates as problem, mechanism, solution. So what is the problem in the world? Why does this solve it? And why is the outcome afterwards better? Which I think at least to me, I think is overly limiting, particularly when you get to higher levels of debates where debates aren't often that simple. And I think this stuff is almost just going to inform what you believe your targets will be in a debate. Does that make sense as to why I think there might be easier ways of conceptualizing a debate?
It does make sense. It just leaves me a bit confused as to, okay, so what do I replace my usual structure with? I mean, in terms of, okay, description of status quo, identifying the stakeholders.
How does it make it better?
Okay. So I think there's two things to say about that. The first is there are obviously other ways in which you can think about debates, and I don't mean for this to be a structure of your speeches. Rather, I think this works as questions which you should ask when you are making specific arguments. So I do want to make that distinction clear. It is still often useful to start with a description of the status quo. It is still useful because that can be very clear in terms of explaining what you are trying to do and what the world is like. However, when you are trying to make each and every argument as to reaching a specific outcome, all I would say is at that point you're asking these specific questions. You could also think about debates in terms of what is the effect on particular stakeholders. And there will be some cases where I think that is quite good in helping you come up with arguments. But even in those circumstances, if you want to say this is going to be the impact on women, or this is going to be the impact on a different minority group, it's still important to ask yourself the questions of why exactly does this happen? Why do you get this outcome? Why is that good or bad? And why is that outcome important? So stakeholder analysis I think of as a more important in terms of trying to work out what arguments you want to make, but not explain how you want to make those arguments. So I think these things are mutually useful rather than necessarily different ways of thinking about debates. And simply what I'm talking about now isn't necessarily a way to structure speeches, because there are clearly other ways which to structure speeches. And I do want to stress, actually, that when I say ask yourself all these questions, that doesn't mean you need to spend the same amount of time on all these questions, partly because, as I said before, analysis is about being useful. Sometimes the answers to these questions are trivial. But these are just things which I think you'll need to consider. Does that make sense? Or yeah, so I'm not trying to give you a structure of how you give your speech. It's just what you need to think about when you analyze a speech or when you analyze an argument. Any other questions before I just move on?
No.
Great. Okay, so what I think is probably useful now is to talk about a couple of debates which keep reappearing. Not necessarily the debate themselves, but some of those themes in a debate, and ways in which you can make the central arguments in that debate as clear as possible, both in terms of identifying them and then analysing them as fully as you could. Does anyone have a preference for what... I listed 7 kinds of debates. Does anyone have a preference for what kind of debate we talk about first? Or any specific motion which isn't too unbalanced or crazy?
Yeah, actually, how would a motion regarding funding the arts fit in those categories?
It would depend. So banning the arts, or
No, but
Or like not funding it anymore?
I mean,
Or giving it to another returning arts. I mean, I don't know.
there was one motion recently.
At
I
the
think it was
Moscow.
open.
Yeah, no state funding for the arts. That's
right.
Any cultural activities.
Right, so I mean, by and large, that debate obviously doesn't fit very specifically in any one of those, but it is a debate, at least the way I see it, more about income inequality and redistribution. And though I think that's one of those debates which fits between multiple different categories in terms of what is useful, what its use is. It's about free speech to some degree. It's about democratic expression. It's about redistribution. Rather than about any single one of those. Perhaps the one other thing I should always mention is these 7 categories are malleable in that you can set a debate which is about multiple of them, many of them at once. And they're more about just areas where if you grasp the central arguments from, you can use in multiple debates, rather than just a mnemonic of all the debates that could ever be in the world. But is that a debate you want to talk about now, or any other debate, or?
That's a good one.
We
That's
always have
a
problems with art related.
Right.
Yeah.
So, what's the wording of the motion then? Removes state subsidies or grants state
Removal
subsidies?
funding. Removal state funding. Removal state funding.
For arts.
And cultural activities, I think.
Yeah, so this house would stop all state funding for the arts and cultural activities.
Okay, for simplicity, let's just assume. Okay, so what do we mean by the arts and cultural activities? Just so we're all on the same page.
Theater.
Okay.
Museums.
Yeah.
Libraries.
Yeah.
Galleries.
Okay. Let's just say
Do we
art
mean
galleries.
library?
So-
Do we include the renovation of buildings, like, I don't know, buildings with artistical value?
Yeah.
As long
So
Any subsidies for
Obviously-
artists themselves.
I don't want to talk too much about definitions, except I think this debate could become messy if you try and make the debate about small subsets. But I think if you are talking about theatres, museums, to some extent libraries, but let's not talk about libraries, and art galleries, you have a fairly clear set of what you're talking about and what the implications would be. I think building restorations or libraries might veer off into slightly different sets of arguments, which are equally valid, but perhaps make the debate less clear in terms of what all teams want to talk about. Right. So when you see that motion, what is the first thing you do? What's the first thing you think about?
The value
Or when you
of
see
art.
any motion?
The value of art.
Okay, that's one of them. But more generally, if you see a motion, what is the first thing you try and identify?
What's the thing I have to prove to win?
Right.
what does the CA want me to talk about?
In many ways, they're meant to be the same thing.
Not always.
Not quite. So the first question to ask yourself is, what do I need to do? What do I need to prove in order to win the debate from my side? I'm not sure how easily this translates to that question, but what do you think you need to do when it comes to showing that you remove all state funding for the arts? What is the burden you have on proposition?
Either you have to prove that it's not the role of the state, or that the state has better things to do, and that taking care of the arts is a waste, or not.
Alternatively, the arts will thrive more effectively without government subsidy.
Or that the arts don't matter.
That the government is controlling it towards its direction to.
Right. Okay. So I think there were 3 distinct claims, one which I actually think collapses into the other. So to take each one of those in turn, the first is that it isn't the role of the state. The second being that it's a waste of state resources, or the state has better things to do. The third is that the arts do very well, or will do better if there isn't state funding for the arts. So those were the 3 different claims which I identified. I want to suggest that both the role of the state and whether or not it's a waste are by and large the same burden or the same argument, which is, I think in most debates, there's always a temptation to say that the state just shouldn't be in this area, or the state just shouldn't do this or shouldn't do that. Those arguments are very difficult to make, except to the degree they are, this is not an efficient use of state resources. Because I think if you had unlimited resources, to argue the state shouldn't promote something which is beneficial would be reasonably hard to do. And I do think it is a difficult burden, even though not an impossible burden, to say that arts have no value at all in society. So I think what you instead want to do is say that this is not a useful use of the state's resources, or that art will thrive. Do you need to win both arguments?
No.
Right. Okay, and I think this is also useful to identify, both when you yourself are prepping and when you are delivering your speeches, which is if you are able to show that either this is a waste of state resources, or the state has other priorities, or art will thrive, you will probably win the debate if you win either one of those two arguments. That is a little bit more complex, because I think there are ways round that in opposition, but I'll talk more about that one in a moment. So let's take each of these arguments in turn. So first let's talk about whether or not we believe this is a good use of state resources. Question 1. Why does it matter whether or not this is a good use of state resources? This sounds obvious, but I just want to tease a few things out.
Well, simply because we don't have unlimited resources, so we should use them in a useful way.
Okay, I agree. Okay, that seems trivial. Can you make that argument in a way which sounds more important?
Well, yeah,
you don't need arts to survive, but other people need certain provide.
That's not the same argument.
Well, there's a cost to it. It's an opportunity cost argument.
Right. I mean, all these arguments are going to be the same, because all I want you to show is why does it, to say that we don't have unlimited resources just doesn't sound particularly powerful or persuasive, even though it is very true. The question is, how do you transform that argument into something which sounds even more powerful? Or how do you try and make it seem really important in the debate and not a trivial claim?
We don't have to prove that arts are bad. You said that yourself. So what we have to do is, okay, what's better than art and loses out because we're still giving money to art?
No, I think like the question was something different, right? Like I think the answer is like we say it's like the state's money is taken from the taxpayers who have to be who are constrained to pay their taxes and lose their income for that money the state has. So we should use it in a very fair way because it's a high burden upon the citizens.
But can't we refer to the crisis and everything's horrible and we just can't afford it?
Right. So you can. I think. So one of the things which is important to realize is everything we're saying is more or less making the same argument, right? All we are saying is there are other priorities and we don't have unlimited resources. The question is, how do you say that in the most persuasive way? That will depend in part who you are and what you find to be the most persuasive. But I think a general rule might be, when you talk about the state's resources, is to try and elucidate in an empathetic way what that opportunity cost is. So Stefan came up with one plausible reason, which is every time the state makes an allocative decision or decides where to spend money, it is harming other individuals within society. Either because those individuals have to pay tax and as a result have their choice limited, or because you aren't helping other disadvantaged groups within society. In a very literal way, all I've said there is, this costs money. But I do think that one of the most important skills is try and elevate the importance of that seemingly trivial claim into one which now has some moral weighting. That said, none of that was analysis. All of that was simply how you frame the argument in a way which makes it seem as strong as possible. And I think that's something which I think we might come back to in a little bit, which is how you make arguments which sound trivial, which don't seem to involve much thought at all, and every single speaker will grasp, into things which are more important in the context of the debate. Does everyone understand just where I want to go with that level of thought when it comes to a debate, which is your choice of language matters so much when it comes to understanding how persuasive your claim is. Okay, so we're happy then with the idea that the state should not, that the state needs to make allocative decisions and they have moral consequences. Why then shouldn't we be involved in the arts? Or to flip it, why should we be involved in the arts and why don't those arguments work? So if you're on the opposition, what are you going to claim?
People need it for self-fulfillment and to, I don't know, criticize the government, I don't know, to express themselves. Okay.
So one would be the idea of expression, which can come out in several ways. Perhaps a strong way to talk about how this expression could be critical of the government, which might be useful for political advancement. So that may be one reason why we find funding the arts to be important. What else might you want to say on opposition?
That art educates the citizens of the state. It's a form of education, and therefore, and that's one of the principal roles of the state, to give education free to all citizens, because it's also an equality matter that we open with that. So arts opens education, free arts opens education to also people who otherwise couldn't afford it, and that's very important that the state takes over that role. Therefore,
don't we assume then that those museums are free? But there are many state-funded museums that are not free. Like you still pay 10 euros.
Okay. We'll come to that bit in a moment, because I think that's useful when looking at the comparative. Why else might you, any other reasons which jump out to you as to why art funding might be valuable?
Art is maybe not self-sustainable as opposed to other things that you could fund. So if you don't fund the arts, it will die, and other things you can just cut the funding and they can take care of themselves. So that's why art deserves special attention.
Right. Okay, so the two things the opposition will need to show, and conversely on proposition you'll need to show are untrue when it comes to this argument, are art is highly valuable and art would be either underprovided or not provided if left purely to the private sector. To put it trivially, this is a debate about market failure. So, once you identify that, you know where you need to go on proposition. You need to explain either what the value of this art is, or why it would still be provided under the market. So what would you then say? What would the arguments you have? What arguments would you try and make to explain why it would still be provided under the market, or why it has value, or doesn't have value?
Like political criticism, you can criticize the government, and it's a freedom of speech, and it's equally as important as like the newspaper and the news.
Okay. So, okay.
Making political statements with art, because journalism is also a kind of art. So.
Okay, so there are other avenues of expression. Where I think that comes in is often when we get debates like this is you jump to the most simple. There's almost a tendency to look at a simplified view of it, which is art valuable at all? But that isn't the comparative. Art would still be produced under the proposition logic of the world, but that art would be provided by the market. The nuance is your case has to be that the extra art or the marginal new art provided because of state subsidies is not valuable given the artwork and cultural activities which will already exist in society. that should be fairly obvious as to what you're proving on proposition.
But on side opposition, I just have to say that okay, but there have been patrons of the arts throughout history, and most art has been funded by private interests in any way. So we still appreciate it. So that doesn't change that we would still have quality art production.
Yeah, but does this include funding like scholarships for art, for artists? Because this argument.
Right. So, to the extent that is state funded, those would presumably be cut. So.
Because that argument doesn't stand because most great artists had funding and scholarships to go to art schools.
Right. So, okay. Let's be Okay. Let's be a little bit more careful, methodical about this. So, what will still be produced? Now, there are presumably some incentives for the continued production and distribution of art. What are they? Why will there still be some art produced?
Well, because you can make money with art, and now the only art produced would be the one that is profitable for the people producing it, or for the people who are so rich that they can afford, like, just for fun doing it.
Which would mean maybe that the art would respond to stereotypes that are already present in society, and art is valuable because sometimes it attacks those stereotypes, and art does not have to be beautiful, but rather it can also just be horrible and still be art.
Right.
So
Okay.
I would have gone with a different type. I would have taken a class structure argument and said that it's not about whether the art is additionally produced, that would be irrelevant, but whether people who would not otherwise have access to art will gain art by the state funding, and whether the education and access to that art is significant to them somehow.
Right. So there's both a demand and supply aspect to it, which is what will be produced and who can access it. So let's just take what will be produced as a result of ending or removing all state funding. You will still have art which is produced, which is useful for the market, i.e. which can be monetized and you can make money out of. And you will still have some art produced which isn't financially viable, but is presumably supported through private donations, exactly as happened throughout history. That seems to be the two likely avenues, then, of funding. Right. So why is that art specifically valuable, or why does that lead to the benefits which the opposition will want to talk about? So potentially, then, there are several things which you'll need to show. Step one. Well, here are some. None of these arguments are necessarily need to be fit together. They can all be independent arguments. They can all be reasons why this is true, without necessarily all needing to stand simultaneously. What I like to call numerical impacting, which is just to say, often if you have lots of reasons why something is true, each one of which is well enough explained, even if some of them don't end up standing by the end of the debate, you still have a fairly powerful case cumulatively. So we're happy to say some art is still being produced. Question one, why could that art still represent worker interests, or why could that still be eclectic and not simply a reproduction of a dominant class belief?
Because art is affordable nowadays. Like back in the days, colors were very expensive, and people, they couldn't afford to buy them themselves. But now through like mass productions, I think everyone basically that has a little money could, buy a canvas and could buy colors and express themselves.
Also, even throughout history, at certain points, the market became saturated with a certain style or a certain trend, and therefore, either because of the desire to innovate or in opposition to what was the status quo, people have created new forms of art in opposition to that or independently of that. So So the art market would still remain dynamic.
Can I invert the question a little bit, which is, I don't think it's about buying the art. I think that's a separate issue, buying or accessing the art, but it's about producing the art. That subsidies, the major value of subsidies is partly, at least, one of the major values is to produce art which otherwise would not be produced. Which is, I think, it's a little bit distinct from buying art, though both of those could be the purpose of a subsidy. So, did someone want to add?
I just wanted to say, like in the past, like there was like in the Constitution you have this guaranteed right to say whatever we want or like stuff like that. So in the past there was some like you had to expect some consequences. If you did produce art, you had to expect consequences. Now in society you don't expect consequences like just from art. So as a result, you could assume that art will still be produced because if it's a way of expressing your thoughts, then and you don't face any consequences. So.
Okay. Okay, I think there's something we can do with that. I'll come back to that one in a moment then.
Are you asking here about the drive to produce art?
Right, yeah, so why will lots of art still be produced, which is from all different classes of society?
I mean, a lot of it is expression. I mean, you can look at ghettos, really poor environments where the art is a means of either rebelling against the system, pointing out despair, showing, just personally expressing their own opinions, even when no money is made. We look at graffiti art.
Right, so absolutely. So the first thing you might want to say is art which represents the views and expression of different groups within society will still be produced whether or not you have state funding. This is both because, by and large, the production of art is not very costly to many individuals. They could, for instance, it doesn't cost huge amounts to paint some good works, right? And more importantly, this isn't simply a historical argument, it's a present argument where the costs of producing art have come down greatly over time just because of the gains in information technology and computing technology allows you to make art, often just in your spare time, without huge amounts of state funding. That might be one potential argument as to why some of the gains of expression have not been lost by ending state funding. That's one thing you could say.
You also make an argument stating maybe that's like a human nature to need to have that need of expression, because go back to the Stone Age, even back then in cave you could find some drawings and some with the most primitive tools, and also in old ancient Egypt, like the hieroglyphs in the caves. And could you draw a correlation between like human nature of having the need to, I don't know, to leave something behind and to make a mark?
Right. So I think perhaps the easier way or most simple way of expressing that is just that if individuals want to express themselves, and many do, and they want to produce art because that's important and meaningful to them, they will do so, and there are low-cost ways in which they can. Which isn't to say that there aren't some high-cost ways which are now maybe barred from, that it might be difficult to have a great theatre production, but we think that loss on the margin is worth it. But second, why else might you still get productions from individuals with, from the working class which reflect the interests and the problems which working class have?
Maybe they want attention and they want to be recognized. And I mean, if less people do it, then the chance is higher that people will listen to me or like watch my stuff if I'm the only theater group producing a play anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So there's you could have a situation where you have art by the working class for the working class, so they are their own market, and therefore you will have a demand.
Right. Yeah, deny the premise in a sense. So the opposition will want to claim that there'll be certain groups shut out because there won't be substantial demand for what they produce. I think you say that is untrue. Does anyone, if you think of the music of Bruce Springsteen, for instance, music which in many ways speaks to what we would consider to be the interests of the working class, or at least initially, but hugely commercially successful, which is good art, will often still have a market, even if it's produced by people of a different economic background than you. This is most obvious if you want to look at many examples of musicians. If you want to look in some examples, I'm sure, of those people written great literature, you can find similar examples, which just yet again is useful to deny that premise, to say you still have productions by individuals who are from those working class backgrounds, because that is still good art, which people will pay to see. What?
But isn't there a difference between the music industry and, for example, writing poems or just painting? Because for music industry, you first need to have a musical education. Like, I mean, if you're not really playing the guitar, I mean, with guitar you don't need to read notes, but with other instruments you have to. Otherwise you will teach yourself. I don't know how that works. Then you need to buy those instruments or rent them. Then you need to go to the studio and produce it. And then you'd only get played by the radios if you pertain to a certain quality, so it's not as easy to produce as other forms of art.
But why is the other forms of art more valuable than the popular, easy form of art to produce?
Because it's more easily distributable.
Yeah, but if there's more demand for it, isn't that because what more people like, enjoy, think of as appropriate forms of art? Why is that? Why should everyone pay for a form of art that is less desirable to them?
No, I would say you could just say that those certain forms of art, they are all desirable, but maybe not profitable, because it just costs disproportionately more money to sustain them. If you
the production to produce them hasn't dropped as much.
So the people like them, but they can only afford it like if it comes at a certain price. Otherwise, even though they would still enjoy it, they have to like let it go, and that's why you have to find it.
I mean, in many ways, I think you're falling into an argumentative trap, which is, it isn't the case that arts councils or any subsidy body would just find a bunch of 6-year-old kids and say, we'll teach you how to play musical instruments and we'll make you great artists. Presumably, and I think this is another argument which is worth making, under either model, there will be some barriers to entry. You will need to be a reasonably accomplished poet. You will need to be a reasonably accomplished singer or musician before they allow you to gain funding. There's just a different access barrier in that in both circumstances you are going to need to be good, and you will be needing to appeal to a funding body. The key in this debate is obviously that who you appeal to changes under the two models. We might talk a bit more about that, about how art thrives, but just be aware that you should never fall into the trap that side can say, we're educating children and you're not. There are still going to be access barriers on both sides. And as long as you can minimize the impact that the excess barriers have, you are in a good position to win the debate. There's obviously, I think, other arguments you can make as to why overall you still end up with lots of high quality art being produced. You can say the market still produces art. It will produce art for a vast number of different groups, partly because that will be enjoyed by members of that group, but numerically large, partly because it can also have mass appeal. So even if, for instance, you look at minority music, like, for instance, jazz music in the United States, it didn't just appeal to that minority because it was good art. It was thus something which became marketable. You could also say that there will be individuals who buy art or who fund the production of art who are willing to take risks. Why is that true? That is often true because you don't make huge amounts of money by producing the same thing again and again and again. You sometimes want to be on the avant-garde. You want to do something different, because that can be very profitable to find niches in markets which otherwise wouldn't exist. I think on the production side, to show that there is still going to be lots of art being produced and explaining why isn't that difficult, in that there are multiple different explanations as to why it is true you still get lots of art produced and why that still appeals to lots of groups within the population. Trivially, that argument is important in the debate, because if it isn't, I have no idea what the opposition is going to be arguing. So does that just make sense in terms of some of the analysis you can have behind it, but also some of the reasons as to why this fact might be true, why you still might get the production of lots of good quality art?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Just, you were talking about production of art, but what I was thinking about is like the state funding often helps the artists themselves providing a living, because you're talking about Bruce Springsteen, but for every Bruce Springsteen, there's like thousands of street artists that hardly make their living, and that state funding helps them try to grow and helps them try to follow their dream. And if you cut the state funding, they won't be able to like afford rent anymore, and you know where I'm going?
Absolutely. What I would like to suggest is the answer to that was somewhat implicit, in that I think it is true that there will be
make a living and can produce the art less. If they don't get the funding and they can continue being artists, less art will be produced because they have to find day jobs.
So I think this is one of those. It is obviously true on the side of proposition that there will be less art produced and fewer artists, or more struggling artists. I think that's just the necessary implication of the proposition case. But I don't think it's that far much of a reach to say that the reason we care about funding struggling artists is because we think by funding those artists you get better artwork. As a result, you get high quality artwork which speaks to important social interests. And thus the point of the proposition is that kind of work, there might be a little bit less of it, but still high quality work which speaks to those interests can still be produced.
But then you would be, the state would be discriminating against the ones that just don't have the economic means to be able to live off their art.
So I think, though, the point is that there will be, you aren't discriminating against those who don't have the means to produce the art, because that can still be profitable, i.e. you can still make money out of it. But yes, it is certainly true that there will be those individuals whose artwork was not profitable, which isn't now being produced, and that is a loss. It is, however, a comparative loss in this debate. Or to put it differently, I think you have to accept that there will be less art produced, and that the art which won't be produced will not have market value. That is, I think, true in the debate, but not an overwhelming argument if you can still show a reasonable amount of art speaking to those interests will be produced. Does that make sense? I agree that what you're saying is true, and I agree what you're saying is a useful line on the opposition. But I think if you are careful enough on the proposition, you say what is important about this argument is we are still speaking to those interests. The best and most valuable art from those working class communities or minority communities is still produced. And maybe one way of impacting that is to say something along the lines of, it is good that art is only produced or primarily produced which people are willing to pay for, because if this great minority art is produced but no one ever accesses it or sees it, the benefits are substantially lower. I think those are all potential ways of responding to that argument. Some will be implicit, others might have to be explicit as the debate plays out.
But as the opposition, wouldn't it be my role to point out that precisely the art that will be lost is very valuable? As I could go like, okay, what about the art that has historical value, the techniques that will be lost because there are no longer any incentives to work in that? I could draw parallels to lost languages or lost knowledge.
Absolutely. I mean, and I do think that is the opposition line, which is what art is not produced, and why is that valuable, and why does it have value beyond people seeing it? I'm certainly not going to pretend there are no arguments for this motion. I just think you have to frame it carefully enough that just seems to be a trivial harm which you are able to absorb by the proposition. And again, I think this is a very clear case of there are arguments you are going to win, there are arguments you are going to lose, and it's important to try and explain why what you win matters more than what you lose. So let's come to that. Let's say you've made the argument, you said there will still be quite a lot of art produced, lots of that art will be valuable, you won't lose all valuable art, though you'll probably lose some on the margin. How do you explain why, even though you've lost some art, the debate still falls on the side of the proposition? So say, for instance, you have less art from minority groups, some art which could be very good but not commercially valuable isn't going to be produced. Why is that less important than what you're arguing on the proposition?
Well, that's the comparative analysis you're talking about, right?
Yeah. So, but how could you phrase it? Because I think in many ways, once you've made all the arguments as to why art's still produced, why lots of it's produced, why that art is valuable, why there's still access, you still need to show why why what you lose isn't as important. So, what could you say about that specifically?
What you could say, but even though I think it's kind of a truism, is to say, well, obviously that art is not that important, because if it was that important, people would be ready to pay for it. I don't think there is the strongest argument on that side. Yeah, another way would...
Yeah, that's one. Any other ideas?
Well, a second idea would be like to say, if you're talking about minority art, and talking about working classes, it's those people who not go into museums anyway. Like, museums are usually frequented by people who have higher education, or at least that's their target group. You could at least claim that in the debate. And in that case, why does it make sense to still fund the art for minority groups if they do not get the benefit from that art?
Another argument would be to say that if the state is funding it, there will also be some kind of criteria that are set by the state, and the artists will no longer produce that which is valued by the people, but that will be valued by the people who are giving them the money. So therefore, the state controls the art into a certain direction which gives them money.
Let's come to that one in a moment, because I think that's the separate argument about what happens to the quality of art under these two models. But I just want to grasp then where I think this response goes, and where the comparative analysis is strongest. And I think there's a few things you could say. I think you can point out what we already have in terms of the most valuable art is still being produced, the art which people see is still being produced. And I think rather than use the term what the market demands or what is demanded by the market, just say that just proxies what people are willing to see, which is if no one ever accesses that art because no one is interested in it, its production has no social value and certainly shouldn't be justified, or shouldn't be funded by the state. I think that might be one way of trying to explain why the art not being produced as a result of this policy doesn't have that much value. The second thing, just to point out, I don't know if it gets you very far, is just to return to what you said at the start, return to the frame at the start, which is they can't simply say that this art has some value and therefore sufficient to win the debate. There are tangible costs of funding that art and creating that art, and they operate on two levels, both in terms of the harm and the opportunity cost in terms of the other important things within society which are not being funded, and the individuals who are losing out as a result of subsidies to the arts. But also it's worth noting that any regime which funds the art would almost certainly also be funding things which would be produced by the market anyway. Which is to say, the subsidy is probably not going to be very good at only selecting art which a market won't produce, because you get lots of applications for it, and some of that art would have been produced anyway, which is just an efficiency loss. And it is true that you are still absorbing that some art won't be produced and some good art won't be produced, but at least you are now probably doing enough to make that argument seem comparatively less important. And that, I think, is possibly the most important lesson which you can learn from this first part of the debate, which is explaining why that comparative falls on your side. It's also, incidentally, if you think about debates in that way, which is why these arguments are more important than any argument you lose, it makes first proposition a much easier position in a debate. Because I think what often happens is you end up with lots of challenges from the opposition where they make arguments against you, and because you've never explained the importance of your arguments, you lose to those opposition teams. However, if you always think, why is my argument important? And why does comparatively this argument win against what the opposition will say or could say, you go a very long way to winning. Okay. Any questions about that?
No, that was clear.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just talk very briefly about the proposition argument about why art thrives, why art might improve as a result, which would independently be a reason to support this policy if you believed, and I just want to add this caveat, if you show art thriving, presumably individuals would also still have to have access to it. So the opposition might argue that poor people won't be able to gain any of the educational benefits of art if you're able to show that those arguments no longer apply, perhaps because distribution through media like the internet means that wealth is no longer a large access barrier. If you win the argument that art is better as a result of no subsidies, you can win this debate. So step one, can anyone give me a couple sentences just to explain why it's true that if art is better without subsidies, the proposition wins the debate? Just to not make it sound like just another argument, but to make it clear that if you win the argument, you win the debate.
Well, funding means you use resources that could in other places be used for benefits, and now actually these resources are used to make something that harms or
harms the quality of the art itself.
So why waste resources on something that is bad?
Okay, I think perhaps maybe another way of phrasing that is to say that the point of of funding of the arts, if there is any point at all, is to produce better quality art, which better represents people's values and has meaning to an audience. What we're going to show is the consequence of funding arts is to produce less of that artwork. And if that is true, all that you have by funding art is a negative distortion, which leads to less of what the opposition wants. In other words, rather than getting what the opposition wants, you make it worse. And just think a sentence or two to try and explain why this argument is freestanding and why this wins you the debate goes such a long way when it comes to, as I said before, stupid judges realizing why this matters in the debate. I don't want to spend too much time on this argument, but anyone would just want to give me a couple of reasons why removing state funding for the arts would lead to better artwork.
competition can generally make people increase the quality, because now people have to actually convince an audience. They have to be more creative to convince an audience, because they won't just get the pay anyways.
Okay, so you have to create better art because you know that there is a consequence of not doing so. That's one. What else is there to say?
It's basically the difference between central planning and the free market system. In central planning, the state decides why are the people who are giving you the money, what is the right seeing part, and what is getting the money, compared to a free market situation where every individual can simply decide on its own what she's going to choose. And if
let's explore that a little bit more. So, the state decides what is valuable. Who in the state decides? Or to put it differently, that it's great to say the state decides, but just to disaggregate that, all the state is a set of institutions which collectivize a group of individuals, and in the end, it's a different set of individuals making the decision. So what do we mean when we say the state decides?
Well, first of all, the government, or the people that are put in charge by the government.
We just mean another group of individuals that are placed in a position of authority to decide for us what constitutes as good art, rather than our own opinion.
Right. What are the consequences? So let's push that a bit further. So that is an accurate description that what all funding bodies are is a group of individuals deciding what is good art and what is valuable art for us. Why are they bad at making that decision?
Probably you get less diverse art, because if that's the big funding pot that everybody wants to get at, well, art is just produced to please those individuals, to appeal to those individuals. Whereas the market is made up of lots of opinions and not just that one group, which means you get more diverse art if you produce for the market than if you produce for that one authority that decides whether you get funding or not.
That is true. Except you're missing one part of that argument, which is you are treating it as the choice is between either the market or state subsidies.
Oh yeah.
So just be very careful about that comparative.
But I think there's still a way to argue that, because if the state makes up for the most part of art funding, like the decision for an artist is likely to be like producing for the state or producing for the market. And if the state funding is more plausible, or is easier to reach usually, or it's the bigger pot, they will produce for the state, and that will mean like less diverse art.
It's not even about if they do the most part, it's when they do it. For example, if I'm an upstart artist and before I can even reach a market, I need to get the approval and the subsidies from the state.
Right.
Then before I even start to produce my art, I already have to overcome the first hurdle of pleasing the state. You can see that as a harm in and of itself, even if in comparison to what the artist will gain later on, the initial subsidy from the state is trivial.
Absolutely. So the important thing to grasp here, though, is both of you have come up with very convincing explanations as to why why the state becomes an important barrier, why it's either more likely artists turn towards the state, or why they still need to please those state bodies. But if all you did with the argument was explain why the state is less good than the market, the argument would be defeated reasonably easily by pointing out that they aren't mutually exclusive. So again, every time you think about an argument, think about both what the response will be, but also be very, very clear as to why the policy leads to the outcome. And the policy doesn't, in this case, lead to the outcome without the explanation as to why the state becomes more important. And I think that's often a subtle point, and it isn't even that difficult to add the few lines of analysis which make that true. But without those lines of analysis, the argument just doesn't have a great deal of power or weight. Right. So rather than talk about this argument in much more detail, does anyone just want to briefly summarize how we showed it was important, how we showed it was true, and how we showed that the outcome was good?
Well, of the second argument, like of the that art will be better under a market model.
Yeah.
Okay. We show that it's important because we basically said, well, the point of funding art is to get good art, and if we can show that art is better off under our model without funding the art is senseless.
Yeah. The argument's important. Yep. Keep going.
Good. How it works is basically saying that if we have the state as an authority funding the art, this leads to artists producing for the state, and this is an incentive that distorts from the the market incentive that is originally there, and so the artists are not actually producing for the people who gonna watch that art later on. They are more producing for that one authority that distributes that art. Funding. And the last was relevance, right? It's relevant because, well, isn't it trivial that's relevant?
In a sense,
it's the same, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in this case, that's a fairly trivial link, but it's useful that you've identified that it was trivial, and it would be a bizarre opposition which challenged it. So as a result, what I think we have here is an argument which is complete. There are no analytic holes, or no obvious analytic holes. There are. It should be very obvious to even the worst judge why this argument matters, and the logic should be very, very clear. As a result, if any judge were to tell you the analysis was incomplete, or they didn't buy it, that really wouldn't have any meaning, because the argument could be defeated by better arguments or better made arguments, but it certainly on its own merit stands up about as completely as it could. Which I think is the major aim, and one of the reasons we got there, almost working backwards, is coming up with the arguments, coming up with the analysis, the explanations, and then just checking that we've explained each and every part of that. Is everyone then happy with the idea of what I think that did and what the exercise entailed?
That's perfect, yeah.
Let's just try another one then. Any of the other topics you're interested in talking about? Perhaps one of the more transferable ones.
It's not a topic per se, but it's a difficulty I struggle with sometimes in analysis, and it's about values. How do I defend a value? How do I say, okay, I stand for justice and this is good. I stand for truth and this is good. I stand for happiness and this is good.
Maybe we can do something with the value of life, maybe death penalty?
Okay.
That's the standard one. I know it's boring, sorry.
No. The reason I struggle a great deal with this isn't that it's boring, but I think in debates about values, we often fall into the trap of trying to defend a value in a Kantian way, which is to say, life is important. Why? Because it really is important. Or justice is important because we have some overriding intuition that justice is important. Both of which are true, neither one of which is at all persuasive in a debating context, which I understand is a major problem when it comes to trying to make those arguments in a debate. But let's see what we come up with and how we try and construct those arguments. The death penalty one, I think, is a fairly good one. And maybe just the easy way of phrasing it, rather than look at the opposition case, is this House would abolish the death penalty, or phrasing it differently, this House believes the United States should have a constitutional ban on the death penalty, which is a little bit of a few nuances to it, but we'll ignore those. Model-wise, no one should have any questions about what the model is. There really shouldn't be any ambiguities, I hope. any ambiguities with the model or what the model will be, which is just good. So what could you show on the proposition to win you the debate? What arguments or what sets of arguments, what are the important burdens which you need to show to win the debate?
I would say that firstly, having the death penalty doesn't solve the problem it originally set out to solve, which is to reduce crime or to provide some kind of remuneration or punishment for that crime, or shall we say the remuneration, the punishment. The second one is that the punishment would never be justified or to the benefit of society by providing that.
Okay. Let's invert those two. Though I agree that they're both things which you could prove. If you show the punishment is unjust or immoral, I think irrespective of the consequences of the punishment, you've won the debate. If you show irrespective of the consequence, it is always wrong to take a human life. That's one option. The other is to say that the consequence of having the death penalty is negative. I want to phrase it slightly differently because I think the way it was phrased was the consequence is neutral, as in it doesn't solve its purpose, which isn't necessarily a reason not to do something. Or to put it differently, it is a very weak reason not to do something to say there is no positive impact. It is a much stronger reason to say that there is a negative impact. And that this would almost always be my lesson. Sometimes you should take the easier way out to say there is no impact. But more often, if you can find a way of explaining something to be negative, that's better. So let's take the first of these claims, which is this policy is immoral. How will you? What are the ways in which you can try and explain it?
A certain loss of experience, contribution, individuality.
Okay. Actually, so I'll invert this. So give me a couple of sentences to explain why this argument is important, / why, if you win this argument, why do you win the debate? How do you phrase that?
The state has the obligation or tries to create justice in a state, and it obviously can only do that if it has just laws and the punishment are considered to be just and that's kind of a tautology. Yeah?
Right. So I'm not going to disagree with you, but I do think it is almost the explanation for why this argument is important / wins you the debate is tautologous, which is we all believe that it is immoral for a state to act immorally. But you can't say that because that sounds outrageously stupid, because it obviously is immoral for the state to act immorally. And I think you almost say that the overriding concern is irrespective of the outcome. If something is immoral, in other words, that that means it will never be just. It is something that any reasonable liberal democratic state should not do.
Wouldn't that come down to definition of morality?
Yes, but I think it's in a sense that you're right, but you can't really have that debate because that's a semantic debate about what a term means. And by and large, I think it's a very odd upline in this debate, which goes, we concede that the death penalty is immoral. Nonetheless, we win the debate. It would be, and what I think you want to do with this, that's what I think what you're doing with the statement, is saying something which is very obvious, but still stating it so the judge knows you understand how important the argument is, so they know how important the argument is, which is if something is immoral, the rest does not matter, because you should not, on behalf of your citizens, subjugate them to immoral acts which waffle on a bit about it, but just try and do this in a short, hand way without saying immorality is immoral. But do you know what I mean? Just trying to explain in just a few sentences why you can win the debate just by showing that if an act is immoral, irrespective of the outcomes, is something a state should not do, particularly because liberal states act on behalf of their citizens, and it is an awful thing when you effectively acting on behalf of them do something which is immoral, thus impugning that immorality on all of them.
But that's the thing. Every death penalty apologist out there will say, "But it's a perfectly moral thing to do."
Yeah, well, exactly. So that's just the setup to say morality matters. So step 2, why is it immoral? Yeah.
Could you also maybe prove that, I don't know, I think one of the reasons why you have, I don't know, why maybe there is definitely to get this kind of retribution from like the I don't know, relatives of the person that was, for example, killed. And by showing that just because that person is killed doesn't really make anything that doesn't bring the other person back, and therefore saying it's not moral for the state to do the same crime that has been done to one of his citizens, regardless of what that person did.
I have a different idea.
Yeah.
Okay. Like what I would try is to say, well, the entire system of criminal law is built to protect the value of life as the highest good, and the entire system of criminal law is basically saying, well, there is no legitimate reason to kill a person, and this is what the state basically embraces in its entire justice system. In its entire justice system.
Yeah, but don't you have the premise to
wait a second, that's something else. And it is just incoherent to say, well, no, citizens are not allowed to kill each other because that's something because life is such an important good. For the state to say, well, no, we can do that because we want to get you out of the way.
Yeah, no, I disagree with that because you have a premise there that life is not necessarily the reason, rather than the state's responsibility to control the use of power within. So it prevents citizens from avoiding life, because if it doesn't have control over it, you'll descend into anarchy and a state in which no one benefits. But the state controlling it in order to provide benefit to the state, to all citizens as a whole, doesn't necessarily mean your entire argument is premised on the idea that the first most important thing that the state has to do is provide life and protect life, rather than protect all other citizens and provide some kind of stability in society of cooperation.
Right. Well, yes, you run with that. You say that you go with the, to quote John Paul II, the culture of death argument, and you say that, okay, if we have... Yeah, but no, seriously, you say that, okay, if we have a state that sees killing people as solving a problem, you are trivializing the destruction of a life and depicting it as a means to an end, and therefore
prove to me the intrinsic value of a life.
Yeah, but self-defense is okay. I mean, there's
war. We accept war. We accept self-defense. So
yeah. I mean, so in that case, so it can under any circumstances.
Okay. So it's of course, in a sense, is one of the most difficult things to do, as we are trying to explain a value which has, where there is no empirically correct way of justifying it, no way of knowing if this is true or this is untrue. So perhaps, I think in a sense, all of these different strategies can get you to the same endpoint, which is life is very important. But what is the most powerful or rhetorically persuasive way of making it? I think a couple of guiding lines I would suggest. The first is, try and stay away from naturalistic fallacies, which is to say that because we do something, that doesn't mean that we should do it. That is a fallacy, I think, which will come up an awful lot in moral debates, which is, we do that or we do something else, and that is analogous to this, and as a result, both of them are okay. When obviously, equally, both of them could be immoral. So that's one thing to avoid. The second is, it's always worth trying to understand that lots of the time making these arguments isn't based on strict analysis. and careful argumentation, but often based on very careful manipulation of language. So I would hate to try and make the argument that human life is overwhelmingly important. Perhaps here are a few ways in which you can. Maybe you can say that as a society, we should always have a positive presumption in favor of human life. This is partly because we could never appropriately value someone's life. We can never understand their experiences or their enjoyment. And it is impossible to commensurate that with other things which happen within society, or other things which happen overall. You could point out that would effectively create one of the most impotent states ever, a moral principle which makes no sense. But it sounds reasonably persuasive just to say that it's impossible to value how important a human life is. Perhaps it might also be good to say that even if we assume that you can trade off human lives against each other, it absolutely should not be done unless it is the only resort and only option available to us.
Right, so don't you have to distinguish the death penalty from every other circumstance where we legitimately recognize the right to take a life?
So I think I'll get to that bit in a moment. And I think thirdly, you might want to make a claim that even if there will be some circumstances where it were possible to legitimately take a life, where that would lead to better moral outcomes in the end, it is one that we as human beings which are generally incapable of making. And it is better that we defer to not taking life whenever we possibly can. Now, obviously, the intuitive response from the opposition, and the one which you're going to get, is here are circumstances where we do take away life, and why is that different? So what are those circumstances?
Abortion.
Self-defense.
No, the self-defense is...
Let's leave that one aside, yeah. Other ones, just in terms of the responses you come up with.
One time we accepted prisoners escaping from when a prisoner escapes, we tend to allow it.
Okay.
And then
All these have in common.
euthanasia in the Netherlands.
Personal choice.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's just take a few of those. The first would be the self-defense examples, which I think are similar to the escaping prisoner examples. We don't think it would be moral for you to use lethal force if you did not need to. The point about being able to kill escaping prisoners or the occasional death on the battlefield is they were to a large degree unavoidable, that we just didn't at that moment have other options available to us. And it was an awful choice that we had to make, but nonetheless one which we made simply because of the lack of alternatives, which is obviously not the case when it comes to the criminal justice system. Maybe I'm not suggesting that's the correct response. I'm just suggesting that might be one way of delineating between self-defense, what happens on the battlefield, and the death penalty. What else might you want to say as to why it is legitimate to take a life on the opposition?
Well, I don't know whether that's something acceptable, but you could go the line and say, well, life is something that we grant to you, and if you do not obey by the laws of our society, we can also take it from you.
We grant you? How do we grant you life?
Well, it's like social contract and stuff, but it sounds like it's the same.
The state gives you license at every step of the way, right?
Unfortunately, when you're a baby, so
therefore we're allowed to control your life evermore, right?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think I wouldn't, when I was constructing the argument from the side of the proposition, think that that would be a likely response, though it isn't. It isn't an illogical response, but it is one which I think has consequences most of us would probably want to shy away from, and as a result seems less persuasive. Which isn't to say it's illogical, it's just to say it seems less powerful than it might otherwise be. And I think maybe your only response to that is, as a conception of what the state is, it grants, you are effectively saying that if the state wanted to enslave human beings, if it wanted to arbitrarily kill human beings, it should be allowed to. And I think you can reject a kind of legal positivism almost at face. Though I admit it's not necessarily that easy. Maybe one other thing which might be worth saying is we're more than happy to accept that obviously these individuals have committed crimes. And these are going to be awful crimes, but we don't think that we should treat individuals purely as a product of a single act, which is to say that, yes, they did something awfully once in their life, or one aspect of their personality was problematic and violent. But at the same time, people are complex in that there are different facets of who they are. They can still, for instance, be loving fathers or loving children. They could still, for instance, be productive members of a workforce. They could still, for instance, be people who think very deeply. They could, for instance, or just other aspects of their personality, which are important as well. And we shouldn't just condemn people to the worst punishment because of one aspect of it. That, again, is nothing more than pure rhetoric, because it has very little meaning. But it seems to be another, what I guess I would call pretend analysis, in that it's manipulation of words to try and do something which sounds like an idea, that people and their personalities are complex enough that that their lives have a great deal of value, a great deal of meaning.
Yeah, Harish, doesn't that line of argument depend on how the other side, the opposition or whatever, it defines when taking a life is justified? Because you're saying they're not just the product of one event. If I was running an op line, I would run it along the lines of, we don't think it's justified in every case, but we think that when someone is placed in prison and can still continue causing havoc and mass harm within society, then it's justified to execute them. Classic examples would be drug smugglers, overlords, mob bosses, terrorists less, because they tend to not, like if you're talking about terror, the mastermind or the perpetrators of genocide, or the leaders of nations, like any of those would still have power, mostly even once we imprison them, would continue to either cause havoc or provide some kind of support, some kind of encouragement while they're still alive to the people, hope that they will come out and continue their course. In those cases, it's not a single incident. It's
so you have to prove irredeemability.
So I actually want to make a distinction, which is I don't mean it to be a single incident per se. I mean it to be a single facet of their personality, which I think is slightly different. But what I would say is one of the reasons why, when I think you're constructing many arguments, it's useful to try and have different explanations as to why something is true. Obviously, consistent different explanations is some may be attacked by the other side. Some might be arguments which you will lose because of the way in which the opposition decides to carry out their case.
On what you said, I'm not sure I understand. Is it the fact that it's only one aspect of their personality?
Yeah.
Do you mean by that we can cure them, we can redeem them, or do you mean by that even if we can't redeem them, we can't reduce them to that?
Yes, I mean the latter, which is you don't want to reduce people to simply a single aspect of their personality. You may still put them in jail or in prison because they're a threat, because because part of them have done awful things, but you shouldn't ignore the fact that they are more complex than just that one characteristic. And perhaps a final.
Why should you grant that right to that prisoner if, for example, he has taken the many facets of one personality and that personality does not have the chance anymore to outlive all these facets because this person that is in jail now has taken it from him?
I think the point is, how do you measure all the facets?
Well, I think that's in a sense so in a sense those two arguments work together, which is on one level, for the first argument is you should never take away a life just because you can never quantify it and its value. I think the second one is, even though what you're saying is true, I think you can characterize that as they have obviously done awful things which will never be possible for us to get full solace or full catharsis about, which is still not the same as saying we should reduce them to that single act. So I think what you're saying is perhaps very powerful rhetorically, but to the degree there is his answer to it in this in the way in which you make the argument, and perhaps you can add some final reasons as to why human life is important. Maybe something along the lines of this should just be. Try and think of any other good reasons. No, actually, I don't have any others. I think those are probably reasonably good sets of reasons as to how you can try and justify the overriding importance of a state protecting human life. Anything else which you might want to say in terms of trying to justify that value?
Couldn't you say that alive, whatever that person has done, he's still more he's still more usable for the state if he's alive? Like, people produce work in prisons. It's not that they're just sitting around, right? I mean,
But they also cost money.
yeah, that's true.
But
We have to do a cost-benefit analysis on this.
Yeah, but then
For every
normally, you
prisoner.
can say that normally executions cost more than keeping them in prison.
Yeah, executions are more expensive for the state than keeping them alive.
Yeah.
Depends on the form of execution.
Okay, then we should keep them alive.
Well, so I think all of those things are true, but I think those speak to a slightly different argument or a slightly different calculus, because is it utile, or what is the cost-benefit analysis of keeping them alive? When I think what you want to show is, irrespective of the cost-benefit analysis, the argument should fall on the side of the proposition because human life is ultimately valuable. So I want to distinguish between them because I think you can win the debate from the side of the proposition by winning either human life is overridingly important, or winning that overall there's a cost-benefit analysis trade-off which falls on your side.
I'd still bring it, no? I mean.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I would bring that as a separate argument. Yeah.
I think there's also a practical argument to say there's always this slight proportion of uncertainty whether that person has actually committed that crime, because a sentence is not necessarily the truth. Like, it's only saying that the jury decided on that person being guilty, but it doesn't mean that actually happened. And if other evidence comes up, which like especially in the US happened after they invented all this DNA technology, there might be new evidence that might be able to, I don't know, free that person from its guilt, or at least lower the sentence or something like that. And you cannot make any changes anymore, or you cannot do justice if you have killed that person, because there's no way to get him back.
And that already happened sometimes when they were sitting like in death row where they're supposed to be executed, and then like in the last minute some evidence came up actually saying that they're not, like proving that they're like didn't do what they were sentenced to death for.
What I would suggest is, I think that is true. You can never be entirely certain, but I think it's the way I think you deploy that argument is almost when you say we should always be cautious, which I would make by saying we should always be cautious by assuming that human life is value. But I think you can also add the extra line, which is, even if you don't buy that, we should always be cautious because we can never be entirely sure about their guilt. Actually, so maybe one other argument for the value of human life, perhaps it's almost the same as what we said before, is just to say that we don't want to make the claim that we don't believe individuals are just purely culpable for their act, which is more often than not there are other societal influences, personal influences which they had no control over, which led them to do these horrendous things. And as a result, we do think they should be appropriately punished by depriving them of their liberty, preventing them from committing these crimes and harming individuals in future as best we can. But at the same time, we don't think it is fair to try and extract vengeance on these people because they are not solely culpable. Or something along those lines might give you another reason as to why human life is important. What I'm trying to grasp or suggest about making these principal arguments is, one, they are very difficult to make and make convincingly. So there are two things which you can do. The first is try and spend a bit of time before you go to debating tournaments or over the next few months, just asking yourself, how can you make that argument convincingly? More often than not, it will be careful manipulation of language, carefully trying just to find ways of expressing things which many of us just intuitively find to be true, but trying to make them as persuasive as possible. And if you can, because this is the kind of argument which will repeat in debate after debate after debate, is find several reasons why something might be true, which is useful because it gives you more grounds of attack and more ways of making the argument seem persuasive just because you're saying more in total as a result of it. The final thing I would generally say about arguments about morality is it is near impossible to make purely deontological arguments, i.e. arguments which are, this is immoral because this is immoral. So it's often best to try and find slightly more sophisticated ways of making a similar argument. So to give you a different debate, or just different start of a debate, let's say the debate is about this house would make the use of armed aerial assault vehicles a war crime.
This house would make the use
of armed unmanned aerial vehicles, i.e. drones, a war crime. I don't want to talk about most of this debate in a great amount of detail, other than to ask yourself, what is the metric under which something should be a war crime? Or what is the metric which suggests something should be immoral? Which I think is going back to the question we asked in the previous debate.
Well, if it does not only attack targets that are of military importance, but would also harm civilians in a great number.
Right. Or to phrase that differently, what you are then claiming is it is always and everywhere unacceptable to kill civilians.
No, I think that the thing is to target civilians instead of killing them.
Yeah, because there will always be civilians in the surroundings of targets, but it's another thing to just attack a school that's on a field somewhere.
So it is always immoral to target civilians. So if you are trying to make that argument as an absolute moral principle, which may be accurate, where do your moral intuitions lie if I was to suggest that you target a city, you will be targeting civilian installations in the city, a few hundred civilians will die, but as a result, you end an entirely destructive war. That's purely a hypothetical example, but do your intuitions still work? Or to put it differently is, do you believe that if by targeting a single civilian, you are able to save hundreds of thousands of other civilians' lives, do you still believe an act is immoral? The act is immoral.
It's a trap.
No, it's Hiroshima. It's the debate about, okay, were the Americans right to drop the atomic bomb on Japan?
I don't want to phrase it that way, because I think that obviously has a great deal of other questions about the extent of how many people die and what the alternatives were. But the one point I want to see if I can get across is, I think it's very difficult to make that absolute statement that it is always immoral, irrespective of what the consequence would be, to target civilians. I'm not saying that is wrong. I'm just saying that I think that is a very difficult argument to make plausible.
And also it's very like difficult if, for example, I don't know, terrorists, I don't know, use human shields or like are, for example, in schools or and then they.
I would phrase the argument differently to make it more convincingly, like using the principle of double effect. It makes a difference whether you target the civilians because like it's like a side effect of something you're trying to achieve, or if you actually intentionally just try to harm them. For example, if like a hijacked airplane is going to be shut down, then you intentionally harm civilian, but the goal is not to kill them, it is to stop the airplane from killing even more people. So there is a moral distinction.
But phrased that way, would it also be perfectly moral if I was to attack a city, but my goal is not to harm civilians, my goal is instead to end a war?
I cause terror. The people,
Well,
the
according
people
to
are fighting me.
yeah.
Okay. So what I would then suggest is, while that may be true, or it may not be true, irrespective, it's not a very useful construct in a debate, because all you do is you play around with words and then you create a category of very few things are immoral, or no act is immoral, and probably nothing then is prima facie a war crime.
I would say where the damage on civilians outweighs the military benefit gained, but of course it's a non-measurement. Like that's
Well,
possible.
I would say there are no civilians in war, especially in. That's not funny. It's a totally reasonable.
Yeah. So. Right. So there's definitely. Right. So I mean, the difficulty I think with making any of those stances is you're trying. It's on most of those, not all of those, are fairly absolute claims about what is moral and what is immoral, which I think are often very difficult for you to prove. It might be very useful in some debates when you want to say that this act is reasonable, is to say that we either think some civilians dying is okay, or that the concept of civilians themselves in a war zone is an irrelevant category, which I think is just another way of saying that we don't believe in the existence of civilians in war. But I'm not sure if any one of these are the most plausible or instructive way of thinking about what morality is, particularly in the concept of debating, and what and the way to make those arguments. So maybe to ask you something slightly different, which is, I still would like to argue that genocide should be a war crime. But I would also hypothesize there would be cases where committing acts of genocide would be overall useful or utile, or by reducing overall civilians being killed. I find that to be a plausible hypothetical. Does everyone think that's at least plausible, even if not likely, that doing the most outrageous war crimes could speed up the end of a war effort?
Yeah, they're all dead. I mean,
right.
But it's
so.
Well, two Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
So, well, that's potentially an example of exactly that.
If you win the war, it's probably allowed. No.
I mean,
but I don't think the criterion we would ever use when assessing whether something is a war crime or whether something is immoral or moral is whether or not it could ever be justified on utilitarian ends. I think that is probably implausible, just in terms of what we consider to be moral and what we consider to be immoral. And that is as simple as me claiming that I would still think acts of genocide should be a war crime. I would still think that they are immoral acts. But at the same time, it is at least conceptually plausible that they maximize overall social utility. So how do I square this circle?
Can we use the mean end distinction somehow, like saying, well, killing civilians as a mean is kind to win the war, to go on military targets is kind of okay, but like specifically having the genocide at the end of your aims is wrong. But that's kind of it's not really convincing, I'd say.
No, it's.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult distinction to put together. So let's say that you can't find a convincing double effect justification or convincing treating people as ends in themselves rather than means to end. Any other way in which you can try and decide what is immoral rather than just turning to utility? Any other thoughts about how you can make that argument?
In that context.
Right, I mean, so
like there's a given set of rules in war.
Okay, so I'll just suggest an option, which is one I don't know if it's always useful, but it's one I often default to, which is to consider things almost as fully utilitarian rather than just purely utilitarian, which is to say that it is plausible that there will be some circumstances where violation of this moral principle or violation of this rule or by committing the war crime will lead to overall more positive effects and more positive outcomes. That is plausible, but that should never be the reasoning for something being moral or for something not being a crime. The reason is that in the majority of circumstances, if not all cases, human beings are incapable of making those moral trade-offs or knowing with certainty what the effect and what the outcome will be. And in those cases, because of those choices which people have to make and the circumstances under which they make those choices, we should always default to certain acts because they are probabilistically going to lead to such great harm compared to their benefits. We should just treat those as immoral on one level or as war crimes on another. On a philosophical level, there are several questions with the issue with rule utilitarianism. But I think on the level of debating, it is often the most convincing explanation, because being purely utilitarian leads to crazy consequences, which by and large we won't buy. Trying to create a deontological approach is often also intuitively difficult to believe, and at least as importantly, is near impossible to explain. To create a rule utilitarian one, which is very much outcome-based, but based on the probable outcome rather than the actual definitive outcome, sounds both quite analytically plausible and at the same time allows you to build some of those principles in ways which are better than just asserting it or better than just stating we already believe it, even if they're not necessarily as philosophically powerful as they otherwise could be. Does that seem like at least a plausible way of perhaps making moral principles sound persuasive, or sound like they work quite well in a debating context?
Well, yes, it does.
Any questions about that, or any way in which you think would be obvious to respond to it?
To be quite honest, I didn't really understood like your last analysis. I understood the utility one, but not the other one.
Well, we have it in the
The precaution principle.
I went it down. I just go to.
Okay.
Maybe if I understand you correct, maybe if I can just try to paraphrase, just to see if I can.
Yeah.
On balance of probability, on balance of harm, it's better to have this than to not.
Yeah, I would. I think Yeah, I think in essence that's the argument, which I think you want to phrase in a slightly different way and phrase it in terms of explaining what we consider intuitively to be a war crime and why we can't just apply utilitarianism, and why rule utilitarianism seems like the appropriate metric to use. And one of the reasons why I think that is actually very powerful in the context of a debate is the other side will almost always look for exceptions. They will look for the occasion when it seems intuitively plausible that you should make these distinctions or you should make the trade-off. So in the case of drones, they might be talking about killing high-value terrorist suspects or high-value terrorists and how bad these people could be. And if you allow the debate just to be about those examples, or about that awful criminal who should be killed because they're an awful human being, you're in a much less powerful position than if you say that isn't what the debate is about. It is about the probable use of this and how it is probabilistically likely to produce negative outcomes, which is why I also think it's strategically advantageous to construct moral principles as rule utilitarian in most debates, at least.
So under that criterion, we argue then that drones, in the way they are probably going to be deployed, they lead to a high civilian damage and and casualties and all this stuff. And
now, obviously, just to make this part, which should be fairly obvious, clear, we haven't actually argued that they are probabilistically going to lead to high civilian damage and they aren't useful. That's what the next 6 minutes of your speech is for. But that is the setup, which then needs to, of which then the other arguments need to flow from. But it is one which I think is advantageous to you because that is a frame which works. In this example, the case of the death penalty debate, I think it is a freestanding argument because it says we should never take a life, therefore we shouldn't use the death penalty. Any other questions about that?
no, makes sense.
Just going back to the death penalty debate, and some of the things we were already hinting at is, once you show that this is a life, I think lots of the other arguments we were discussing then become your second set of arguments, which is, even if you don't believe that human life should be protected by the state and shouldn't be taken away when other alternatives exist, this policy is does not lead to positive outcomes, does not lead to the ends which the opposition seek, and in fact have these negative implications. You have few potential ways, again, of winning the debate, and winning either one has won you that debate. And you get to point that out, and you get to win, ideally both, but either one, and you've won the debate. Does that? I don't want to go through those arguments in context, but that's what I think the value of it is.
That's then actually what Stefan said, right? That's the second part of what we're going to talk about. Stefan's example about probably the drones will kill many civilians and therefore it's bad. But before that, you need to go on about how valuable life is and blah blah.
Who said that?
So, in the debate about drones, odds are that you don't need to talk in depth about how valuable human life is, just because in 95% of debates, human life is valuable and very valuable is a premise which both sides will agree on. The difficulty in the drone debate is you could try and argue that human life is overriding concern, and as a result, the use of drones is immoral because the use of killing anyone would be immoral. I think that is a harder burden than the one you need to take on yourself, which is instead killing innocent civilians is immoral. Obviously, a much easier one to win than killing terrorists is immoral.
I have a question on the drone debate.
Yeah.
Could it potentially become a cookie-cutter debate where both sides agree that the aim is to have a war that protects civilians, or a war in which civilians' casualties are reduced, and the debate is then about on whether drones lead to more casualties or to less casualties out of civilians. Couldn't that be a way the debate might deteriorate to, especially in the second half?
Right, so the debate could deteriorate into that. What I would say, though, is that's a debate which the proposition is in a very good position to win. In part because if you start with the rule utilitarian setup, your next 12, 13 minutes of the two speeches are, this is why lots of civilians die. You are engaging very directly in that debate. And I mean, the opposition line will definitely be that these are necessary strikes and these are moral because of the outcome. That will be the debate you have, but it is one you are set up to win.
I've had the drone debate and I couldn't see really what was the difference if you have that debate between, okay, using drones or using, I don't know, missiles or whatever. So what is it in drones specifically that causes the additional damage?
Oh, right. So there's a couple of things I would say. The first is, in that debate, you do not have to defend other indiscriminate acts if they are sufficiently analogous to a drone strike. That's one thing to point out. However, you will also want to try and find distinctions. Yeah.
Sorry, on that point, would you then just take the line of, therefore, all missile strikes and bombings are also going to be crimes against humanity?
No, I don't think you necessarily. So, I mean, so there are different choices which you could take. One of them would be that using bombs against against cities should clearly be crimes against humanity / war crimes. I'm pretty sure that's already the status quo. I think you could also say, for instance, I think that's one potential line, and you don't need to defend those acts. The line I would probably want to take instead are some justifications as to why drones might well be different than use of missiles. It might well be because the targeting systems you put in place. It might be because when you have unmanned aerial vehicles, you're targeting them from a much closer range, right? So the example would be that when you have drones, you have command stations in Colorado where people feel they're playing a video game. When you're using missile strikes, one of two things occur. Either those are missile strikes in the sense that they are from far away ICBM strikes, which will almost never be used against small civilian targets because you don't have the range, or instead it will be airstrikes where you don't have those problems because you're far more in immediate range. That said, I do admit that's one of the difficulties you have with the debate, but it isn't implausible for you to also rule out other kinds of actions. Does that make sense as potential strategies? And I don't immediately know which one I would go for. I would possibly go for both. And play it on an either-or level.
Sounds legit.
Yeah. Okay. Any final questions then? Or any topics you want me to talk about briefly?
Final question. I think everybody's a little bit.
I didn't pay attention for the last 2 minutes. So.
I think people are already tired as well. So
yeah.
Is there a way to know, I don't know, during prep time, if you reached the closing point of the analysis? Because I sometimes have the feeling that I'm not really there yet. I don't get the end of my analysis, and probably I can really see it myself when I've reached that final level. Is there a way to, I don't know, be able to learn knowing that? I don't know.
Not simply, as in, I think it's almost just an intuition where you realize things don't need to be explained any further. My general rule would be, would I question this premise? And if the answer is no, if I was on the other side, would I question this premise? If the answer is no, I'm generally happy to say the argument's being fully fleshed out. That is an imprecise rule because it is very difficult to know when that point is reached, but it's probably a reasonable guideline. Any other quick questions then?
I'd say.
Just in case, if we have additional questions, could we, I don't know, PM you or something like that?
Yeah. Probably the easiest way to message me is via Facebook, or I'll email you. I'll email Stefan or some of my notes on arguments to make and some general examples which are very useful in debates. But feel free to either Facebook me or email me. Generally, I should be able to respond to most of those.
I've got another question.
Yeah.
How far would you go with scribbling down your parts of analysis? Because some people tend to try to write down every inch of their speech because they're afraid of losing bits of their analysis and their argument wouldn't make sense. And other people just rely on a few sentences and come up with the stuff at the minute, at the second where they start. Or would it just be best to just have a few words that guide you along?
So you definitely will want to know before you stand up what you are going to say and what the analysis will be. That's obviously true. I'm using either case. I would just tend to use a few words, but I actually really think it matters who you are. I think sometimes they're going to be key sentences, which I want to write out in full because I think they are good explanations of what is going on, or key ways of phrasing the bits in the debate or the analysis in the debate. But more often than not, I think if you just have a few sentences, I find it easy enough to know what I'm going to say. Sometimes you need more, but the trade-off is it's difficult to write that much, and it's also difficult to read your notes exclusively in a debate. So I don't have an answer for that. I think it's just over time, as you become more and more comfortable about what you say, you sometimes just use fewer notes. But I would always use some. And there are some cases where I would write entire sentences if I thought it was valuable, and if I thought they were very, very key.
Perhaps just one last thing. In terms of prep, how paranoid should I be about what the opposing side's going to throw at me? Because it might distract me from my own points or prevent me from finishing them.
Right. So the one thing which I didn't stress, because I think it's almost which I think it's always a little bit dangerous when I say this, but treat this carefully, which is the point of analysis is to make your argument stand up to challenge. You should always be thinking, what will the opposition say in response to this argument? Because that will guide how much time you spend making each link on the argument. So anytime I make an argument, I think, what is the statement? Where does it fit in the debate? And what would you say in response to it? And how do I make sure that I have explicit or implicit responses to it? So my feeling is always ask yourself what the responses will be, because if you don't, the argument can easily be defeated. In part because debating is about making sure your arguments can stand up to challenge.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you.
No problem at all, and hope to see all of you reasonably soon. And if you have any questions in the meantime, just drop me a message.